several options, and it's basically like starting to prepare material for the open lecture. Okay? And then when we meet next year, the first 2 sessions, we're going to have the in-class assignments, the last 2 of the semester. And those are going to be basically that you have group opportunities for group work, where you then, with the material that you prepared over the Christmas break, start putting the lecture together. Okay, that's the idea. And so I will write in detail on that, what you can do, but it's basically, yeah. There's several options. Like either you can propose a reading for the lecture, or a graph, or some thought about one of the actors. It's very flexible, and it's very short, low intensity. So say maximum 1 hour of work between now and the 7th of January. Okay, but not more. Okay. So today's topic is agriculture and rural development, and I will try to motivate why that's important, and from a practical point of view. But then let me also say beforehand that I think it's maybe one of my favorite topics to show you what development economics is about at the end of the day, because it will. It's one topic where kind of this economic way of thinking, in my opinion, really helps to understand what otherwise might look like puzzling facts and institutions and behaviors in development contexts. Okay, so it's kind of this one sense where it goes back to this motivation, right? Yeah.
Sorry, could you just close the curtain a little bit to the right?
Don't you want to relocate to a less sunny spot?
In the middle of the room, no, I think he is very well.
Tell me stop.
Yeah.
Is this okay?
Just a little bit more. Perfect, thank you.
Yeah, so if you remember, that was kind of a motivating question, right? You can think of that as how I put it in very broad terms at the beginning, but now you can focus really on the particular activity those 2 agents are doing, which is agriculture and production, right? We're going to try to understand, okay, why do we see this broad range of production processes or technological systems for the production of agriculture. Okay, the kind of the practical relevance is that it's twofold. One is that agriculture at the end of the day is kind of an economic activity of fundamental importance, because we need a certain amount of food to sustain the world population we currently have. We know population is going to increase, right? That's what we saw last lecture. By the end of the century, we're now currently 8 billion. By the end of the century, we're going to be 11. So 3 more billion people are going to join the planet. They need to be sustained with food, and so that's one motivation. We need to produce more food. You will see in the lecture on climate change and development that also agriculture is one of the activities which is the most environmentally unfriendly. And so we have the second motivation. We need to produce more food, and we need to do it in a sustainable way. Okay? We're going to see it's going to be, we're going to need to produce a lot more food, ideally using much less land. Okay? That's only possible if the productivity of agriculture increases a lot. So think of that kind of more like the supply side. On the demand side, we know that the last pocket of widespread poverty, remember how today, currently 10% of the world population lives under extreme poverty as defined by the World Bank, and the vast majority of those people live in rural areas, and their main economic activity is last pockets of widespread extreme poverty are in rural areas of people doing mostly agriculture. That's kind of the second practical relevance why it is important to look at the agricultural sector. Okay? So there are people who argue, to eradicate extreme poverty and malnutrition, this last 10% which are left, maybe it's going to be less about economic growth more generally. It's going to be maybe much more targeted to rural development and agricultural development. Okay. So here's one quote which makes that point in a very strong, categorical way, I think. So this is from Theodor Schultz. He won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 1979, and he's kind of a development economist who has worked a lot on agriculture. And this is how he justifies it. He's talking in 1979, so the first sentence was true at the time, it's not true anymore. Most of the people in the world are poor. This, again, thinking about this World Bank extreme poverty definition, that's no longer the case. It was the case in 1979, not no longer the case, now it would be about 10%. This is why most people in the world are poor. So if we knew the economics of being poor, we would know much of the economics that really matters. So the first one is kind of this defense of development economics, is kind of the economics that really matters the most for most of the population in the world. And then he makes this interesting point. Within development economics, agricultural economics is the one that really matters. Because it claims most of the world's poor people earn their living from agriculture. That's indeed still true, or even more true than it was back then. So if we knew the economics of agriculture, we would know much of the economics of being poor, which is that the economics that really matter. Yeah? Okay. This graph we will see in the lecture on climate change and development, but now still look at it from this kind of agricultural perspective. This is kind of a very nice breakdown of agriculture. Is kind of very land-intensive use activity. So in the whole planet, about 1/3 or less than 1/3 is land, the rest is ocean. Of that land, kind of 71% is something that we can inhabit as humans, and the rest is kind of desert or ice. Of the share that we can inhabit at the moment, about half is used for agricultural production. 37% are forests, and then the rest is kind of peanuts. Okay? There are lakes, there are cities, and there are something in between. Of the half that we use for agriculture, 77% is livestock. So it's kind of, pastures for cows, sheep, goats, whatever. Yeah? And only 23% of the agricultural land is actually crops. Right? So the first figure you saw, the wheat field, or rice cultivation, things like that. Okay? And then the point which is going to be very interesting for the lecture on climate is actually most of the calories that we consume are plant-based globally, from a global perspective. And so there's kind of this mismatch where we use a lot of land for livestock production to produce meat and dairy products. But that's actually, we get very few calories out of it. Okay, so from this kind of pure nutrition perspective, this is kind of a very inefficient way of using the land. Okay? Yeah. This is going to matter much more for the climate lecture, because that's going to be much more carbon intensive type of activity. Yeah. But in general, that's kind of the problem we face. We need to increase food production. At the same time, we cannot really expand land much more. Right? We should be reducing it. Yeah. There's not much left, and the type of land we're using now, it's a disaster from the point of view of carbon emissions. key thing to achieve is agricultural productivity needs to increase. Okay? We need to use the land we have much more efficiently. That ties very nicely to the poverty problem. If we increase agricultural productivity a lot, this might be a route out of poverty for the extreme poor who are trapped in rural areas doing low productivity agriculture. Okay, so that's kind of one of the cases where it might be a two birds, one stone problem. Okay. Okay. As usual, we start with kind of the good news in terms of long run patterns, and then we'll look at the still existing problems. The good news is, again, at the global level, what needs to be done is what has been going on. You see, this is a cumulative change in quantities of interest. The first one is population. Since the 1960s, population has increased a lot. Global population, right? By 150%. That's what we saw last week. But agricultural production has outpaced that growth. Okay? So despite the fact that we had this massive increase in population in the world, we have more food available than ever before, and the growth in food production has been higher than the growth in population. Here they will show you cereal production, so a specific type of crop wheats that we saw. And just for measurement purposes, it's very easy to compare, but this is true across the board. Okay, it's not specific to cereal, but to agriculture in general. And the nice thing is, this has been almost all of the increase in cereal production is explained by higher productivity and not by more land. Okay. Since 1960. Yeah. So
sorry.
Yeah.
Why we should increase the productivity in agriculture sector, since they they are so unbeneficial, and why at all compared to the third sector, like the service sector, and the second, why is that so important to increase the productivity?
Because you need to feed a large population.
The food consumption is not only only demand for the population, I guess, and why the productivity is so important?
Because you need to feed a growing population, so you need to produce more food. At the same time, you should not increase the land use. And so the only thing available is you need to produce more for the land you already have. Ideally, you should reduce the land you already have. So ideally, we would stop deforesting, and we should reforest and so on. So you should produce more food, because there are more people on the planet, using less land. The only way to do that is to produce more food for an existing unit of land. That's the definition of productivity.
How does productivity increase through technological advances, or okay?
Yeah, we'll talk about it. That's going to be the big question, right? But that's one of the main.
What's the difference between the cereal yield and the cereal production?
Right. Yeah. So yield is productivity. Cereal yield is how many. So cereal production is how many tons do you produce in general, and yield is how many tons per unit of land. So that's a measure of productivity. Yeah. Okay. So there are two. Sorry. Maybe I should have started from the beginning. There are two ways of producing more food. There are two ways. Okay. Either you just grow more land. Yeah. That will be this thing. So the amount of land used for cereal production, it has increased a bit, but it's marginal. Right? Globally, it's marginal. And you can produce more per unit of land. And that's this one, that's the yield. And what this graph tells you is of the total growth in production, almost all of it is explained by increases in the productivity and and not increases in the amount of land.
Okay, so the difference between the green line and the red line is what is caused by the slight increase
Yeah,
in
exactly.
land. Okay.
Exactly.
Do you know what happened in the 2003 or whatever that is so low? Lower than ever.
Yeah, yeah. So I wouldn't give too much information.
No, but I think it's not the area which is being used.
Yeah, it's not the area, it's the goal.
only the change.
It's a change.
Okay.
It's a change. Yeah. So yeah.
Do you have the same comparison between livestock and crop in
No,
this field?
that will be interesting. Yeah. Okay. Now, second caveat. This is global level. Okay. So this small change, small increase at the global level does not mean that if you look at specific regions, you don't see dramatic changes, right? So what you're going to have hidden here is, for example, in Brazil, Bolivia, Peru, countries of the Amazon forest, but also Indonesia, so places which still have a lot of intact rainforest, massive increases in the amount of land used for agriculture. Yeah? But at the same time, you have in places like the US, Europe, other parts of Asia, reductions in the area of agriculture. And so at the end, the global level, it's not so much, but of course it's still very problematic, the increases we have in particular regions, especially when this is, but that's more from a global perspective, so there we will focus more on that, okay? But the whole point is kind of, overall, this is what would need to happen in kind of a purely agricultural economic system. Yeah? Now, again, this does not happen everywhere the same way. And these are kind of the two most striking examples. The experience of South Asia, so people like India, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and so on, and Sub-Saharan Africa. Okay? And there you have the two opposite cases. In South Asia, it's basically again very similar to the world pattern. It's massive rises in productivity. Yeah? Very few increases in land. Yeah, since 1960 till now. And of course, massive increases in population over this period, right? Sub-Saharan Africa, the other way around, right? So there's kind of almost the same, the increase in land and increase in productivity is almost the same, and the increase in productivity is much, much lower than what we are seeing in South Asia. Right? That explains why nowadays, or that's why one of the explanations why nowadays, most of extreme poverty is located in Sub-Saharan Africa. If you zoom in, it's going to be rural areas of Sub-Saharan Africa, people doing agriculture. One way of viewing that is in the last 5-6 decades, the productivity of that type of activity was really, really low. Right? In South Asia, for example, you see massive exit out of poverty, and one explanation is productivity of agriculture there was increasing much, much faster. Remember from last week, where do we expect the most increases in population until 2100 to take place?
In Africa.
Yeah, that's the key challenge. This is a huge problem. From an environmental perspective as well, right? We're still, that's the region where we're still adding a lot of land to agriculture, and productivity is very low. That's where currently already most of global poverty is concentrated, and that's where we expect most increases in global population to happen until the end of the century. So all those things together are the challenge. Okay?
And why is it in Asia that they can get so much more cereal out of the land, and in Africa it isn't the cause? Is it for geological reasons, or maybe they don't have enough machine or?
Yeah, that's a big question. So that's, it's similar to like why are some countries richer and others are poor.
Yeah.
So there are many different explanations. I think there's no definitive one. But what have you heard of the Green Revolution? Does this tell something? So this is kind of one in the 60s. So in the 60s, basically what we see from Africa for Africa now was kind of the horror scenario for South Asia in the 60s. In the sense that this was extremely poor, a lot of population, and the population expected to increase a lot. And so there was a huge program of technological innovation led by international agronomists. This usually is called the Green Revolution. And the idea was they really tried to develop crops that were adapted to the context of South Asia. So those are all those things, kind of golden rice and things like that. So this is really kind of it's a technical solution of saying, okay, where are the main crops they are growing, where are the main problems those crops face, resistance to different natural disasters, fortification with iron and other nutrients. And then there was a huge program of trying to kind of create crops that could be used for cultivation in those areas for poor households, and some people think that was the side. But it's a lot of general economic growth as well in that region. So it's a bit hard to say what also.
You know, if the agricultural productivity is equally distributed across Asia, like is it the same in China and India, for example, or is it like mainly China and whereas like South Asia is lagging behind?
So it's not evenly distributed, it's across the board increases. Yeah, so the timing is maybe China probably starts much earlier, in India a bit later, but we see it across the board, but also places like Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, Philippines, it's across the board. Yeah, but it's not the same everywhere. And the Africa is also one of these. Okay, yeah. Okay, those are kind of broad patterns. Maybe positive news and where the challenge is, okay? As usual, that's a bit kind of how every lecture starts here, more or less. Okay. Now, let's jump to the more interesting part. And this is now very micro level, okay? Now we're really going to try to understand it from the perspective of a household in poverty in a rural area who is producing agricultural goods. How should we understand their behavior and their constraints? So now it's going to become hopefully very interesting economics from now. So the first thing we need is a type of agriculture. We need to understand how the production function in agriculture looks like. Okay? You can think of this as having different inputs. So things you need to throw in, and then at the end you get some output, like a cow, milk, cheese, or a crop, a ton of rice, or a ton of wheat, or a ton of coffee. Okay? But for now, we kind of put all those things abstract from what exactly it is. It is being produced, but it's being produced through this specific production function where you need some amount of labor. Okay? And depending on the crop, depending on the technology you use, this might be more or less. But some labor is needed. You need some kind of physical capital. Again, you can think of the whole range, right? From the Indian farmer that I show you has a small hole, and tool to mix the soil, to the US farmer that combined harvest, which is this huge machine that's right? Harvest everything automatically, right? But you can think of all them, put them in this bag of physical capital, okay? The most rudimentary to the most advanced. You need some kind of agricultural specific inputs. So you need seeds, if you're growing crops, you need eggs if you're growing chickens, things like that. Then you can think of like fertilizer, again, from the most traditional one to the most advanced one, pesticides, and then some kind of irrigation technique. This is already quite specific. And then maybe the most specific things are kind of the natural inputs. You need land, right? This is kind of key. If I'm a software engineer, I don't need land in my production function. If I'm an agricultural producer, I need land in my production function. Okay? And then there's to some extent some kind of natural input that is needed. Either sunlight, rainfall, temperature, humidity of the soil, things like that. Right? You cannot do it everywhere. You cannot produce coffee beans in Germany because of this part. Right? The constraint is not labor, it's not physical capital, it's not the inputs. The constraint is nature. Yeah? So that matters a lot. So it's a very specific activity. Right? It's not easy to. One of the fun things about the Trump tariffs, which is like you put a tariff to get production which went out abroad back in the US. This might work for a shoe factory. It won't work for coffee beans produced in Colombia. It won't work for avocados produced in Mexico. It won't work for bananas produced in Ecuador. Right? So then putting a tariff is just ridiculous. Even if you buy this idea that it's to reindustrialize the country. Okay, and then the productivity measures, the main one is going to be this yield. Yield is literally like how much you produce divided by how much area you need to produce. And so usually it's going to be some measure like tons per hectare. That's one of a very common way of measuring it. You might have kilos per square meter or something like that. And this hectare we're going to see later. So 1 hectare, kind of a football field, is kind of 0.8 hectares. Okay, so an hectare is something a bit larger than a football field. It's not a British value. And then you can also think of like labor productivity, right? If you want, how much value added can work in some measure. But typically we'll think about that because we're going to be very land plays such a big role that kind of normalizing things like the area you use is usually the most commonly used measure. Okay. What makes this a very interesting activity is that it is probably, at the same time as like activity, human beings are doing for the longest time. Since the transition to the Neolithic Revolution, transition to agriculture. Since that point. At the same time, it's probably the economic activity with most market failures we can think of. Okay? That's what makes it kind of the place where, or the activity where most poor people are trapped. That's kind of already kind of the development economics approach to this. So, certain things which are kind of very, very important features of agricultural production is a lot of risk, a lot of uncertainty, by the fact that we depend on the weather to a great extent, right? Which is something we do not control. And then, of course, you might depend also on huge variations in prices. Right now, there was a bad harvest, or a couple of seasons with bad harvests in cocoa, the raw material for chocolate. Mainly due to the weather in West Africa, there's a huge increase in price of chocolate as a result. Okay? This is really kind of massive, and you might have the other way around. Right? So there are huge fluctuations in prices. What would be, imagine we have fully functioning market and complete markets. What would be kind of the market or the institution that would deal with this? If you have a lot of risk and uncertainty, what is kind of the device that allows you to deal with this? In a perfect world.
Stock markets?
Yeah, more specific? Not necessarily. Part of it, but not necessarily. Yeah.
Insurance?
Insurance market, yeah. So it could be outside of the stock market. The insurance markets are the device that allows you to deal with this. you say, I'm aware, my livelihood depends on the weather. I can get an insurance where I pay a premium when the weather is good, and I get an insurance payment when the weather is bad. Right? Just like you do for health or work insurance. Yeah. We do the same for prices. We do medicine for prices. We have an insurance product which insures you against a huge drop in the price. And as a result, you have to pay a premium. The price is okay. Yeah? As we're going to see, in most rural areas in developing countries, there's no functioning insurance market. But there's going to be a very specific informal insurance market. Okay? This is the first thing that fails. Yeah?
Is this because weather conditions are changing so much, or is it because...
No, it's because basically there's no... we're going to look at it with the weather. Maybe I do. Yeah, that will add to the problem. Climate change will add to the problem, will make the risks much higher. But even without climate change, the problem is basic. It's a market failure, so there's no incentives for private insurers to go and insure small scale very poor farmers. It's the same reason why credit markets are also in this. Okay. Another thing, which is very important in agricultural production, there's a huge time lag between when you need to use the inputs, so when you put the seed, when you plant, and when you get the output, when you harvest. Right? Again, if I'm a software engineer, maybe I write my code and I immediately get paid for my service, or if I'm employed, I get paid at the end of the month. Here you have to imagine the farmer puts the seeds, puts the pesticide, puts the fertilizer, takes the weeds out, prepares the land, and then sometimes 6 months later, there's a harvest where you can finally sell this in the market and get paid. Right? Fixed coffee production, you put coffee trees and so on, and then 7 years later, you get the first harvest, for example. Okay? So there's huge timeline. You need money to do those investments, but you only get the output much later. Yeah? What will be the market that allows us to do this with this timeline?
Bank loans?
Yeah, the credit market. And the credit market is exactly the solution to this kind of temporal problem. It's the same problem as I'm 30 years old, I want to buy a house now, or a flat to live, but I'm only gonna kind of receive the money, my income, in the next 40 years, right? And then how can you do that? Well, you go to the bank and say, I get a loan now, and I pay the loan back with my income later on. At the small scale, this is what farmers need to do every single season. Yeah.
Do farmers usually have contracts where they say, okay, I will harvest it and then I'm sure that I can sell it? Or is it mostly like, okay, I will do my job and then maybe can sell it?
Yeah, so there are two, I want to take this into two ways. The first one is kind of see what would be the ideal market institution that deals with that. Then the point is going to be there. They are all, to some extent, failing. Not there or only partially in function. And then we're going to see how do they solve the problem. And then it's going to be exactly things like that. Okay? Okay? So, financial markets. For saving and credit, they do not exist. Then you can also think of there's also huge seasonality of labor. So labor is, in agriculture, is concentrated in specific seasons, right? So usually when you plant and when you harvest, then there are times in between where not much is going on. Yeah? It's called lean season. And so, for example, another market which would usually help with this would be if there are other types of activities, non-farm activities that people can do between seasons. Yeah? And that's works to some extent, but not as well as we would wish. Now, another thing. If I'm a software engineer and I have a certain task, and I don't do it today, but I do it tomorrow or something, maybe it's, or a week later, maybe that's fine. In agriculture, timing matters a lot, right? So kind of certain things, if you don't harvest now, but next week, then maybe everything is rotten, or it's not of use anymore. And the same with planting, right? If planting depends on the rainy season or so on, planting a couple of weeks later might already ruin your whole harvest if you miss the rainy season and things like that. Okay? So the timing is super crucial. Right? It's an activity that is like, where timing matters a lot. And so if timing matters a lot, then you need to access those inputs, the seeds, the fertilizer, the rain, the labor. They also need to be coordinated in a specific time. Yeah? It's of no use to have access to cheap labor throughout the year if then the 2 weeks where you harvest your crop, labor is not there. It doesn't matter, right? It's only about this. The timing is very crucial. Okay, what would help with this? Yeah.
Good question records in the region.
Yeah. What else? Yeah.
Project management.
Yeah, the other thing, like more, that's too high. More like, I need to buy my seeds, or I need to get labor now. What is the, what do I need? It's maybe too obvious.
The labor market?
Yeah, you need the markets in
Yeah.
general, right? You need inputs and output markets. And again, this is not obvious if, for example, the time of the rainy season when you should plant and get seeds, fertilizer, and labor, it's also the time where the roads are flooded and there's not, and the transport infrastructure collapses. That would be a failure of this input market, or the other way around. Like the time where you harvest is the hurricane season, and that's where you don't have access to the output market. And so maybe you have your beautiful bananas or beautiful cocoa harvested. If you cannot sell it in the next 2 weeks, they just rot and everything is gone, right? And so this access to the inputs and output markets is crucial at the time when it's needed. Yeah. I would maybe put the information part more on as a risk management, but it would totally be another market failure, this kind of information asymmetry. Yeah. Or information about pricing is also crucial. Okay, and the last one is the land. Going back to the land, which, at least in the short run, is mostly something that is fixed, that you cannot change. Right? You can change your labor, you can change the crop you grow, you can change your fertilizer. In most cases, you won't be able to change the land you have available to you in the short term. In the long term, you can grow. In the short term, it's something that is immobile, or in the market that lets you do this.
Real estate?
Yeah, exactly. So kind of, first of all, well-defined property rights. Maybe the first step, which is not obvious, is to say that you know and can prove this here is my land where I'm allowed to make decisions and sell the output. And then land markets, so things like rental, land sales, purchasing land, selling land, renting land, and all those things, of course, need as the first step that is the well-defined property right. You cannot rent something out if it's not clear who owns it, right? And again, as you're going to see, that's a Canadian problem. And so this combination of basically everything that you might imagine is kind of important and specific to agriculture is attached to a market or an institution which would have solved that is either not there or very incomplete. This creates this fundamental problem, this kind of explanation why we see this low productivity, high extent of poverty, and so on. And so the interesting question is, okay, how do they do that, right? So how do people manage those risks and those dimensions when they don't have access to kind of the textbook economic institutions that we might think? And that's where things get very interesting, okay? And that's where kind of, if you look at this through this lens, then all all sorts of behavior that might look puzzling to you, and institutions that might look weird, become, you finally understand them. If you understand them as kind of solutions, local solutions to this problem. And that's what things like Vorlesung. Okay. Okay. There are a couple more that we can think of. There are a lot of environmental externalities of agricultural production. This is now, of course, none of this is kind of specific to poor people in the global south, right? So kind of the farmer who has a highly productive farm in the US, he faces the same issues, but of course, he has kind of complete markets available to him or her. Yeah? Okay. And then there are other things which are common to everyone, right? Huge environmental externalities, the kind of pesticide or fertilizer you use ends up in the groundwater and messes up the health of the people around, carbon emissions, all those things, right? And the corresponding market institution would be some kind of environmental standards, regulation, carbon tax, whatever. You also have, in developing countries, many, many small-scale farmers. Okay? Sometimes working in very, very small farms where you don't get the economies of scale to use the kind of technology that might be most productive. It's so small, and maybe the terrain is so irregular, it doesn't pay off to have a combined harvest in such a small piece of land. And then the idea is, okay, how do we make kind of technological progress that is targeted to that type of activity, right? And again, that's not going to be the private market who's going to generate that. The private market will always kind of push technological progress for the large, highly productive type of agriculture, okay? Because that's the one where it pays off to do that. So there has to be a public good that is provided. Yeah.
Would communities or like Genossenschaften help here as well to protect?
Yeah, sure. So kind of other ways of organizing this. Yeah. And then the last thing, which is again very crucial, is the boundary of the firm and the household is not clear at all for agricultural farmers. So most of those small-scale farmers, you have to understand them as a household and not as a firm. Okay? And so what that means, for the most part, is production and consumption decisions are linked and not separate. Right? In an agricultural firm, let me show you, maybe it's easier with the picture. The production of wheat, this guy, has zero impact on how much bread he and his family eat. Right? It's completely separate from the consumption decisions he makes. So here it's probably most likely different. It's kind of that's a production decision, at the same time that's probably a consumption decision. Okay? Probably kind of most of the food the household, the family of this farmer will eat is going to be produced in that field as well. Okay.
One very important further factor is also the security. In particular in Sub-Sahara, the civil wars, I think, occupy so much land.
Yeah. You could think of that as kind of a very mental level. That's something that's usually introduced to those two. Right? That might be a huge problem to get your harvest somewhere if there's war and you don't have access to other geographies, and also for here, land is occupied. It's not clear what the rules are, who owns it, and so on. Okay. This will mean also that kind of shocks to the household, right? Bad things that happen to the household will immediately have a consequence on the production side of things, which in a farm will not, right? So again, if I'm a software engineer and my grandmother died or something, that's maybe, probably has some effects, my mental health and productivity and so on, but it's not, won't really change how I do my job. In this case, it probably most likely will, right? Because maybe that's was family labor to the farm, etc. Okay? And there, the institution which would cover this would be if we would have a very nice social insurance system that would insure against those type of household shocks, unemployment, war, or violence, health, and so on. That would be one way of separating a bit those decisions. Since we don't have them, for the most part, those decisions are highly interlinked. And so when households are thinking about production of agriculture, they will also be thinking about consumption decisions and how to manage household shocks. Okay, in a way that agricultural firms won't do. Okay, any questions? So here's some terminology. When we call smallholder farming, we usually talk about units. It's going to be typically a family which is cultivating less than 2 hectares of land. So I think they can have less than a bit, or maybe a little bit more than 2 football fields as the maximum. Sometimes much smaller than that. So this is very small. Okay? So this is not kind of pieces of land where you can walk easily everywhere, right? Okay. And we're going to see that that's going to be very different in other parts of the world. Like the picture of the guy with the combine harvest, that's probably a farm where you spray pesticides with a little airplane, and it's kind of you cannot walk the whole field on your own. Those are much larger units. So this is relatively small, or very small. So that's what we're going to focus on. Then subsistence farming means that most of what is produced is for own consumption and not for the market. Okay? Those usually are the same population overlap a lot. Then there's also the distinction between what is a staple crop and a cash crop. Staple crop is typically the main food that is consumed in a particular cultural context by a large share of the population. That might be wheat, rice, in many parts of Asia, cassava in many parts of Sub-Saharan Africa, potatoes famously historically in Ireland, for example. Right? So there's one food that provides most of the calories in the local diet. There are some estimates for medieval Europe where wheat was the main crop. And kind of a normal peasant would eat meat, maybe, I don't know, once or twice a year during a big religious festival or something like that. And there, the estimates that I saw are crazy. So then it was kind of the average peasant in medieval Europe would eat something like 3 to 4 kilos of bread every day. And that was the diet. Very few vegetables, very few meat. Similar to what Chinese peasant would eat, also rice. Or Indian peasants would eat also rice. Okay? This will become a staple crop. And that's typically what these units are producing. And then a cash crop is something that is kind of produced entirely for the market, right? If someone has a coffee farm, it's not only consumption that they're producing the coffee for, it's to sell, or cocoa, or palm oil, or soybeans. Right? There's no one who has a diet based on soybeans, right? And so that difference is important. And then in terms of land, tenure is kind of who owns and uses the land. Then I have 2 players which are very important. There's the landlord who owns the land in a formal sense, has the property rights of the land, and might rent the land against compensation. And then there's the tenant farmer who is someone who does not own the land but uses the land, cultivates on the land, and has to pay the rent to the landlord. Just like the rental market would work in Berlin, for example. Yeah? Then there are kind of two major rent institutions, or like land tenure institutions in the world, and we're going to see that's going to play a key role later. So let's define that. A rent is what you know from the real estate market in Berlin, a fixed payment for the use of land, okay, which is defined, I don't know, 2,000 rupees every month, or every quarter, or every season, or every year. So there's a pretty fine time interval which both parties agree on, and there's a monetary amount that this guy pays to this guy. Sharecropping, on the other hand, is to say, at the end of the season, this guy will pay X% of whatever was produced to the landlord. Okay? And then it's not, the amount is not predefined. It depends on how much is produced. A very common one is a 50-50 sharecropping. At the end of the season, of whatever tons of rice that are produced, or cassava, or whatever, the tenant pays 50% of the landlord. Okay?
I had a question in the case of the crops being owned by a company because they are genetically modified. Who is then in charge of paying for the tenant or the landlord? Was it more case specific?
So who owns the land, for example, a big plantation?
Who would have to pay for the crops being used? Does it then fall to the tenant farmer, who will then plants and takes care of it? Or is it the landlord who actually controls the land and decides what is done? Or does it depend case specific?
Yeah, I think it would depend on the exact arrangement. But you'll find the main things, right? So then, those are all kind of things where there is some tenant farmer who decides. So here kind of he's paying for the use of the land, but then in theory, this guy can make the decisions he wants. He can decide what to plant, when to plant, how much effort to put, and so on and so forth, as long as he pays the rent. Yeah? And then there's kind of the other extreme would be, a big company which comes, makes all decisions, and then hires labor. Right? But there you wouldn't call it a tenant farmer, there would be a hired agricultural labor. Because it's the firm who makes all the decisions. Okay? Most of those guys, so the reason I'm focusing on them is that most of those people fall into that. Or they own the land. Right? But they are not kind of hired by someone else.
But sharecropping is more risky for the landlord if it's.
We'll get there. Yeah. So all of those things will play a role. Okay. But just first to know exactly what is what. Yeah. So any question on how do you find them? Yeah. Okay. Then most of the overlaps are those very small owners or farmers are subsistence farmers. They're subsistence farmers, meaning they're growing one of those staple crops and not cash crops. And either they are not own these small units of land, in some cases through kind of customary land rights where it's not clear who owns what, but kind of the community lets everyone use it. Or there's some landlord who owns the land, and then they pay one of those two types of rents. Okay? That's kind of the profile of the family you should have in mind. Okay. And then you can think of like very idealized types of farmers. Very idealized. You can think of kind of the development of the rural economy as being more or less a transition from type 1 to type 3. Okay? And so they would have a subsistent, sometimes called peasant, farmer, who produces staple crops with very little specialization. They're going to grow several things at the same time, but all kind of things that they will eat. They will use traditional cultivation methods. Think of like a picture of the Indian farmer I show you, and they will have very low productivity. Then you might have something like a type in between, like a diversified mixed family farmer who will only consume a relatively smaller share of what they produce, and the rest they will sell in the market. And they will have then some cash crops as well, not only staple crops. They will use some more modern cultivation methods. They might have a tractor, they might use chemical fertilizers, chemical pesticides, might have an irrigation system, things like that. And they will have some kind of productivity which is much higher than the subsistence farm. And then at the end you have kind of the US farm I showed you the picture, where this is everything is produced for the market. It's a firm, so it's again not linked to a household anymore. It's not a family business anymore, it's a firm. And they will use most advanced cultivating methods. And nowadays with a lot of artificial intelligence and everything is optimized. It's also very capital intensive, not so much labor intensive. And they will have very high productivity. Okay? And again, you can think of development as, on average, historically having been the transition from type 1 to type 3. Okay? So that's basically what will happen in Germany, for example. Yeah, or what will happen in history. And here it's a situation where maybe a large share of the rural population is engaged in agriculture. This is a situation where it's 2-3% of the labor force, which is actually working on average. Yeah? Okay. So the first question is, why are we doing it? Okay. There was a huge debate in economics, which was, are they, those type of farmers, are they rational? Are they kind of the proof that in economics we don't have this rationality, rational agents operating? Why are they doing those type of things? Why are they using those methods? Why are they so unproductive? And then one explanation was, this is all kind of, it's their culture, it's their way of life, and all those things mean they are not rational. We shouldn't treat them as rational agents. Okay? This was a real debate. We shouldn't treat them as rational agents. They are just kind of, they are kind of a residual of history. Right? There's some peasant who was there for centuries, but it's kind of a cultural active, they belong in an ethnographic museum. Right? And then what's interesting is then to explain, if you reject this view, try to explain, okay, what is the rationality behind this type of production pattern? Okay? And the key is, this is what comes out when you mix agriculture, the specific type of agriculture production, with all these market failures that we saw before. When you mix those two, when you recognize the type of market failures they are facing, then it becomes clear that this is what comes out. Okay? And so this is this very, very nice answer to this debate. Okay? So one thing is like, why are they not growing? Why do people grow wheat and rice and eat most of it instead of growing a cash crop? With a cash crop, they make much more. The returns are much higher. They make much more profit. With that profit, they would go and buy twice as many rice in the market as they could produce themselves. Right? This is kind of the why. This seems very irrational. Right? Why are they not investing more productive means and things like that? And so the first thing to recognize is, as a result of poverty, what the best way to understand how those farmers are operating is not as profit maximizers or expected profit maximizers, but as risk minimizers. Okay? And because agriculture is a very risky activity, it depends on the weather, on prices and things like that, and insurance markets are not available, then actually the rational thing to do if you live close to the poverty line or under the poverty line is to minimize the risk that the disaster happens and not to maximize your expected profit at all costs. idea is like very close to subsistence level. Bad risk might be the end, right? And so that's the thing you want to avoid at all costs. And that would be, or that's a very plausible explanation why then you rather grow the thing that is 70% of your local diet all the time, even in a very unproductive way. But that kind of covers the minimum you need, rather than going for a fancy production method or going for a cash crop where you're not sure in a bad year the price goes down and then you're screwed. Right? And again, a firm can deal with those type of shocks very easily. If it's a bad year, you take a credit, you activate your insurance, whatever, and you survive this bad year, and then you wait for better years to come. If you're a farmer who's a subsistence level and you don't have that type of tools available to you, a bad year could be your child dies, or you have a health problem, or you have to sell your land and then it's over. Yeah? So think of those two techniques, right? This is kind of the way of understanding risk. This is the probability that certain things happen, and this is the productivity measure. This is the yield of the crop. This is kind of fake numbers, just to get a feeling. Then you can imagine there are two techniques, technique A, technique B. Should be clear that technique B has a higher expected return on average. You get something close to 12, right? While with technique A, you get something close to 10. So on average, technique B is much better, but it's also much more risky, right? And the risk distribution is much wider than technique A. Yeah? So you might have very good years, you might have very bad years. Okay? And in technique A, you're much closer to the average. Okay? And then the idea is, if you just see farmers as they should maximize the expected return, it's a puzzle. Why are people studying technique A and not moving to technique B? Are they rational? Should we understand this rational? If you see, given all the market failures they face, what they're doing is probably minimizing risk. And then obviously it becomes obvious the technique A is superior, if that's the thing you want to minimize. Yeah? Does that make sense? Okay, then let's move to let's focus a bit on this piece, and then we'll go to So we can think of two types of agricultural risk. There's going to be something which will go by the fancy name of idiosyncratic risk. That's kind of anything that is specific to a particular farmer or a farmer household or family. Okay? So that would be something like health, or maybe someone moving away, or lack of effort, or things like that. Right? Something that kind of it's something that happens specifically to a certain farmer, or something that the farmer can choose on. And then there's a second level, which you can think as common risk. And those are things that will affect all farmers of a certain area in more or less the same way. Those are going to become weather and market risks. Right? If there's a flood, it's very likely that the whole village gets affected, not just a specific farmer. If it doesn't rain and there's a drought, so can the whole certain geographic area which is affected, not just one individual farm. Or if the price goes down, it's again everyone that sells the product who faces the risk, not an individual farmer. This distinction is very important because what you will find is this risk is already insured. And you can understand a lot of kind of social institutions of rural life in the global south as insurance against this type of risk. Okay? And some are very interesting ones. So things like big religious festivals or big harvest parties or things like that, you can think of this as really kind of a way where every year, in a kind of a ritualized way, that is highly public, so everyone observes who is doing what. People had by luck had a good year, compensating those that had bad. So think of this really as this is informal insurance. Yeah. Without, not in a market sense, but like this operates as informal insurance. Gifts, gift giving, all those things are informal insurance devices. Okay? There are ways in which people had a good year by luck or people had a bad year because of a health shock, that they average out over time. Yeah? So they really kind of, all those kind of harvest, spring parties, and things like that, religious festivals, they have to be public so that you observe, right? This only works if everyone can see and can sanction people who fail to do that. That's why it has this very public character. But you can see, you really understand that it's kind of insuring against this type of things. Okay. What is left is this type. This is impossible to insure within the community because everyone is hit at the same time. Right? But this is uninsurable within the village. This one is because in every given year some are more lucky than others, for whatever reason. For an average everyone, you can compensate. Here, if everyone is on average poor, there's nothing to. There's no insurance possible. Yeah? So the type of risk that is left is this one. Yeah? There's some ways of trying to do that. Can you think of something?
Price controls, for example?
No, more like the perspective of the farmer or the villages. How would you deal with that? So there's research for India, and the key thing is like, and that's what makes it extremely interesting. They will never, they have to look for things which fulfill those tasks, but they are not explicitly so. Right? A village party is not explicitly an insurance. It's not soul like it's part of a culture, tradition, whatever. But it works in that. That's what explains why it exists. It's very persistent. Why people spend huge amount of money organizing those kind of things. That's kind of how we rationalize. And here, of course, things like that.
I will think that to reduce the techniques. Reduce the techniques for the agriculture sector, because the reason is that the original point is much more important, and so that somehow if we don't talk like some high needs like only in this sector agriculture, and to reduce the risk, to reduce the technologies and so that techniques, so that you will not facing like time delaying or some kind of issue, because the technology was not very difficult, it was not very easy to control, and that's why kind of, to keep the original point and to align the principles with the agriculture sector. So
yeah, I agree. I think that also is better into this part. That will explain why the most modern technique available to a farmer is not necessarily the best if it comes with a higher risk. That's why you might choose to keep with the things you know, that you know they are very unproductive, but the risk is very low, or it's very easy to manage. I guess I'll fit more into this part. But in this, can you figure out something?
Maybe some education programs, how to protect against weather efficiently, and some training effects.
I guess here the key is like, think of, so most of the solutions are reproducing this at a community level. And so what you would see is, this is, or people who use this problem to rationalize, for example, in India, marriage contracts between different communities. So there's kind of research showing when there's a common risk, when a community has a drought, or if it's a natural disaster, then what you see is they start marrying their daughter. So in India, it's all arranged marriages in rural areas. So I can say this in this kind of strong words. So households start marrying their daughters earlier to people from other villages. Okay, and that's kind of one rationalization of that is they're using their daughters as kind of insurance, and because it's a community risk, you cannot marry them within your own village. That wouldn't work, right? And then you see kind of the distance and the age of the daughters. The age goes down, so you marry your daughters earlier and to more distant villages. And the idea is the further you go, the less likely they are also affected by this conflict. Another very common issue is migration decisions. You can understand rural, urban, but also international migration as rural households trying to diversify from common risks, right? Also migration to multiple destinations, yeah? And with different seasonality patterns. But that's the key, that's the difficult one, which is not, there's no perfect, this is the very difficult one to ensure against, okay? Okay. So the last thing I have for today is to think then about keeping in mind that that's the uninsurable one, and to think about the contracts. And to simplify things, let's think of the decision between a pure rent and a share property contract. You can write, there's a kind of nice way of writing any rental contract in a way that fits everything together. So call a rental contract R, and we can imagine two components. Alpha, which is going to be a share of Y, which is the agricultural output, whatever is produced by the farmer, and then F, which is a lump sum fixed payment. Okay. And so if this guy is 0, and only this one is left, and this one is positive, this is a fixed rent. Right? The rent is you pay F every period, whatever that period might be. It's kind of the classical rental contract. That's how, I don't know, the real estate market operates in Berlin. If this one is gone, if this is 0, and this alpha is between 0 and 1, then what you have is a pure sharecropping contract. Where every period you pay 50%, 20%, 30%, whatever, of whatever you produce. And no fixed amount. Yeah? It varies with production. This is pure sharecropping. And then the last one you can think of is if alpha is 0, this one is gone, and this F is negative, then it's a wage contract. Then it's the landlord who is paying you every period F, and in return you work for it. Yeah? Does that make sense? Yeah. So if F is negative, the negative rent is the wage you get. So the transfer is in the other direction. Okay? From a pure economic perspective, what would be the most efficient contract? Meaning this is what I mean with the pure economic perspective. What would be the contract that maximizes production?
I would say sharecropping.
Why?
Because it encourages the farmer to increase productivity.
Why? I think you're thinking way, but like
it's inverse. I mean, like fixed rental contract
Exactly.
because it increases encourages perfect.
Yeah, exactly. And so it's the most efficient one are the fixed rent ones, so either this one or the wage labor, right? Precisely because they do not depend on Y, so they're kind of lump sum, so they do not interfere with the decision, with the optimal decision of producing Y. Okay? So the optimal, how do you get to the maximum when the marginal productivity of the farmer equals the marginal cost, right? This F does not influence the marginal cost. It's a lump sum. It's a fixed then it doesn't matter. For shared cropping, this one is clearly influencing the output, so it influences the marginal cost. And because it's something you give away from the farmer's perspective, you can think of it as a tax on production. Each additional unit of Y gets taxed by alpha. So this will reduce